There's something about the decimation and devolution during the post-Soviet period that really fascinates me. I don't know if it's witnessing the complete collapse and cultural destruction of one of the most powerful and influential empires in all of history, or the fact that out of said destruction and chaos has emerged a new era, a new culture and people. In the current year, the atrocities and horrific acts of oppression committed by the Soviet government onto its citizens is considered fairly well known, albeit poorly documented. Soviet law was king in this godless quarter of the planet, and although state propagandists didn't mandate worship of the state as a literal deity, like in many historic empires like the Romans, or even in modern North Korea, it was fairly clear that Soviet officials wanted sole obedience and devotion to the leader and state. This, of course, became an issue of contention when challenged by the authority of the various religious sects in the old Russian Empire that had occupied the land centuries before Marx or Lenin took their first breaths. The religious landscape of the pre-Soviet Russian Empire was dominated by Christianity. It included many minority religious groups such as Islam and Buddhism, who occupied huge swaths of territory in some parts of the country, along with Judaism and various pagan groups who were relegated to smaller pockets scattered throughout the land. Before the arrival of the Orthodox Christian Church, the Russian people were largely paganistic, having no real unity or allegiance to any higher power, and it wasn't until around 1,000 years ago when the Kievan Rus adopted the Christianity of the Byzantines. Interestingly, it would appear that Islam was actually adopted in parts of the Russian Empire before Christianity was, seeing how Muslims swept through the region of Central Asia around 1300 years ago during its rapid expanse and conquest after its founding. Judaism has also had a very old history dating back to 1400 years when Ashkenazi Jews first spread to Eastern Europe. Because of the traditional marriage between church and state in the old Russian Empire, the Orthodox Church had a huge influence over government, and religious laws were considered legally binding for hundreds of years as implemented by the various Tsars of Russia. Although minorities of Islam, Catholicism, and Lutheranism existed in the empire from an early time, Orthodoxy dominated politics, culture, and government, with many Russians using Orthodoxy as a defining characteristic of their identity. In what could probably be described as one of the largest and quickest paradigm shifts in modern history, the Orthodox Church was declared irrelevant in the Russian Revolution of 1917, which was largely a backlash against misuse of agriculture implemented by the imperialist government and Tsar Nicholas II. Because of the historic connection between government and church, the Russian people, or proletariat, largely turned against any and all institutionalized religious bodies under the doctrines of Marxist communism. Thousands of churches across the Union were shut down, with the hostility and frustrations of the proletariat being largely directed at religious leaders. The Soviet Union was the first nation in the history of the world to institute atheism as the official state religion, and it wasn't long until Christians found themselves in the minority for the first time since the medieval age. Various estimates place the percentage of Russians that identified with Christianity in 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union, at anywhere from 15 to 30%, and the entirety of the country had a meager 1,500 active churches, meaning that less than 1% of self-identified Christians attended religious services at least once a week. In today's Russia, approximately 60 to 80% of the population identifies with the religious group, effectively making it a religious revival in the span of less than 3 decades. However, Christianity is not the only religion in the post-Soviet countries that has experienced a huge surge in adherents, with many other religious groups having an increase, with atheism declining from 70% to only 20% in the same time period. Now, unlike Christianity, Islam never really went away in the Soviet Union. Despite the highly atheistic government's attempt to stifle the faith, the majority of Muslims in Central Asia and the Caucasus region continued to openly practice, although the government heavily cracked down on the number of mosques in the country, shutting down nearly 98% of mosques in the country over the course of 60 years, and only allowing a handful to be built throughout the decades of its existence. Vladimir Lenin was actually revered among the Muslim population of the Union for being quite sympathetic to the community when compared to the suppression the Muslims endured from the previous regimes of the Russian Empire. Initially, he allowed for Sharia law to be implemented alongside the Soviet laws in the Muslim communities of Central Asia, and even declared various Muslim celebrations as official holidays in the region. After Lenin's demise in the 1920s and Joseph Stalin's rise to power, the Union took up a more hard-lined and ruthless stance on the religion, heavily discouraging the practice and attempting to artificially decrease the number of Muslims through lowering the birth rate and deportation. Although the majority of Turkic Central Asian groups retained their religion throughout the USSR's existence, they were largely contained to their homeland in the various Central Asian republics and became far more secular. Today, the region has experienced a bit of a religious revival, with the most religious post-Soviet Central Asian country probably being Tajikistan, which experienced the least Russian influence and where 98 to 99% of the population practices Islam to this day. In recent years, because of a huge migration of Muslims from various parts of the ex-Soviet Union, Moscow's population of Muslims is around 5 to 10%, or around 500,000 to 1 million people. Despite this, the mayor of Moscow has allowed for only 4 mosques to be built in the entirety of the city. So, think of that what you may. Although adherence to Islam is officially very high for this group at around 90%, the Vulgar Tatars of Russia, the country's second largest ethnic group, are debatably far more secular and moderate than Muslims from other regions of the country, such as Chechens or various Caucasian ethnic groups of the federal subject of Dagestan. The Chechens are quite infamous for perhaps becoming a little too devout in their faith, as the Chechen people have a strong sense of nationalism and independence deeply rooted in Islam, and have taken up a very staunch and radical stance on independence. Before 1989, around the eve of the dissolution of the Union, there had been only one terrorist attack in the history of the USSR's existence. In the past 30 years, however, there have been over 2,000 separate terrorist attacks in Russia, the majority committed by Chechen separatists, and it's no secret that a large number of Chechen rebels have been taking their devotion to the next level, taking up arms and moving to the Middle East, where over 2,000 Chechens have joined the ranks of Islamist terrorist groups like ISIS. Perhaps the most interesting of all is the rise of Buddhism in the former Soviet Union, with there being 3 main Buddhist groups in the region, that being the Kalmyks in the west, descended from a Mongol tribe who migrated to the region about 400 years ago, the Buryats, located right above the Republic of Mongolia, also being descended from Mongols, and the Tuvans, the only Turkic ethnic group that predominantly follows Buddhism. Under Soviet rule, Buddhism, like other religions, was heavily discouraged and many temples were shut down, leading to a rise in secularism in these aforementioned territories. However, since the fall, nearly every former Buddhist group in the entire country has experienced a large increase in adherence and devotion. Not only has Buddhism become popular among these various groups, but a large increase in immigration from the Orient has also contributed to the rise, such as immigrants from Vietnam and China, with there being an estimated 200,000 to 1 million Han-Chinese immigrants in the country, although the majority are temporary residents or illegal aliens. One faith that is not indigenous to the former Soviet states that you might not have thought of gaining steam in the region is Hinduism, which has won over around 100,000 to 200,000 people in the country of Russia alone since the fall of the USSR, which is still less than 0.2% of the country's population, but it's still quite impressive considering how it is the only place in the Western world with a large number of Hindu converts. Contrary to what you might be thinking, the majority of Hindu adherents in Russia are not South Asian immigrants, but ethnic Russians or other Slavic groups, with there being a large homegrown movement to spread Hinduism in the country. One of the religious groups that has not experienced this spiritual uprising is one of the most ancient religions of all, that being adherents to Judaism. In Russia, there are around 300 to 400,000 people of Ashkenazi Jewish descent, with there being up to 1 million people with at least some Jewish ancestry. Remember, Jewish can be both an ethnic and religious group. However, less than a third of those are actively practicing the faith of Judaism. Jews have faced some of the worst persecution of any group in Russia in the past 150 years, with around 75% of the Jewish community of the Soviet Union perishing in the Holocaust, and around 2/3 of that surviving population migrating to Israel after its foundation as the Jewish homeland. During this period, the Jewish people had been united through culture, history, ethnicity, and shared hardships among the members, with religion largely taking a back seat in their struggle to maintain their identity, becoming mostly irrelevant to the majority of ethnic Jews by the turn of the 21st century. This correlation of Jews and secularism is actually occurring all over the world, including Israel, with there being no end in sight to this trend of irreligion. Various groups may find the trend of expansion of faith in Russia to be a predictable pattern of human behavior, brought on by the misery and failures experienced during perestroika and the ensuing economic and social collapse. Others might see the return to God as the baseline of human instinct and the fascinating resolve of the human spirit to not give up in the pursuit of happiness and truth. One thing for sure is that the return in faith has drastically altered the politics of the post-Soviet states of Russia and Central Asia alike, and for better or worse, traditional values and family structure is making a comeback in this region, defying the growth of agnosticism and atheism in most of the Western world. And it's going to be interesting how their newfound identities rooted in Orthodox Christianity and Islam is going to alter the politics of the countries in the years to come. Go ahead and let me know your thoughts on this growth in religion in the former Soviet Union in the comments section below. As always, thanks for watching everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.